All right, so our next unit begins with the respiratory system, one of my favorite lectures. The great thing about the respiratory system, and we're coming off of the cardiovascular system, is actually a lot of similarities that exist. Hey, we talked a lot about pressure gradients with regards to blood flow. We're going to see a lot of things related to blood pressure gradients with gas flow. Okay. So we're going to be talking about breathing, and breathing is involving various pressure changes that occur within our respiratory system passageways. Now, our respiratory system contributes to homeostasis by providing for the exchange of gases, those gases being oxygen and carbon dioxide. This involves exchange between our atmospheric air and our blood and our tissues, or tissue cells, as it states. Okay, so for like oxygen has to come from the atmosphere into our blood and then into our tissues. For CO2, we're going the opposite direction from our tissues into our blood and then out into the atmosphere. And that involves those pressure changes that I'm going to be talking about. By regulating CO2 levels, we also utilize our respiratory system for regulating pH. We're going to talk about the reaction that joins water to carbon dioxide to form an acid. And if we don't change our breathing rate, our pH will get out of whack. And we know how important pH is for normal function. If pH changes, proteins denature, and as we know, proteins are responsible for just about everything occurring in our body. Something that we really want to talk about is the third, and it's a list of functions here: receptors for the senses of smell, filtering inspired air, production of vocal sounds, and the excretion of small amounts of water and heat. Okay, a little bit here, anatomy-based stuff, just kind of introducing you to what's part of the respiratory system. We can divide the respiratory system and its structures into kind of two different ways. The first is a structural division and involves an upper and lower respiratory tract. We have for the upper, the nose, divisions of the pharynx and the larynx. If we go back to that first picture, and you can throw in mouth really because some people breathe through their mouth. Okay. So we have the ways for air to come in. We've got the pharynx, which is a shared tube that we'll talk about more in the digestive system, because that's also the tube that carries food into our esophagus. Here we're talking about it carrying air into our trachea. Before it gets to our trachea, it runs to our larynx. So our larynx is also known as our voice box. Okay. Your pharynx is known as your throat. Okay. So those are some terms that you've, I'm sure, heard before. Okay. Your trachea is your windpipe, and then it branches to form your bronchial tree, which your bronchial tree is found inside your lungs, and those structures are part of the lower respiratory tract. Okay. As far as that goes, we're not really too concerned with those ways to divide the respiratory system. The functional way is very important. We divide that into a conducting zone and a respiratory zone. Okay. The conducting zone does exactly what it sounds like. It conducts air to the lungs. So those are basically air passageways, and that's it. Okay. They just carry air, and that includes stuff from your nose all the way down to your bronchial tree, specifically what we call our terminal bronchioles, for getting close to the tips of the bronchial tree. Respiratory zone involves primarily these structures called alveoli, which we'll talk about a lot. Those are little grape-like in structure balls inside of our lungs where gases are actually exchanged, which is what the respiratory system is built for. Our lungs are located in our thoracic cavity, also consists of the heart, large blood vessels, trachea, esophagus, and thymus. Not that that's really important for us. Surrounding it are two wet epithelial membranes, a parietal pleura and a visceral pleura, separated by a thin space. Basically, it's a potential space, and I'll tell you why I say potential space here in a second, which is called the intrapleural space. Okay. Our parietal pleura is the thin superficial membrane. The visceral pleura is what covers our lungs. Okay. You can think of those two membranes like what happens when you glue your hands together. Okay? What I mean is, when your hands are glued together, and if the glue is holding strong enough, you pull your hands away, eventually they're going to snap back together. And if you pull your hand to the right, the other hand's going to go with it. And you pull your left hand to the left, your right hand's going to go with it. That's what happens with these two membranes. Okay? They're stuck to one another, and that's because there's a vacuum within them. So the space, not technically a gap or opening, it's basically what could be a space, but it's really, really, really minimal. Okay? And that's because those two membranes like to kind of stick to one another, if you think of it like your hands stuck together with glue. To help with this, the glue is not glue, but it is pleural fluid, which reduces the friction between them, helping them to prevent from rubbing on one another, and produces surface tension, which is what causes them to stick together. Now, the act of respiration involves the movement of gases and exchanges of gases in our body, which is what respiration really is. We have pulmonary ventilation, which is the act of breathing that most people think of when they think of the respiratory system. That's just one of the steps. Okay? That's just inhaling and exhaling, bringing oxygen in and removing CO2. Over on the right here, we see a figure of those alveoli put together in clumps, kind of like how grapes are in clusters. The whole cluster of grapes in this case, if you want to use that as the analogy, is called an alveolar sac. They are fed by the very tips of our respiratory or bronchial tree. Okay. Each of these little balls is a hollow structure where the gases are exchanged. Doesn't show it, but each one of these is going to be fed by our pulmonary capillaries, allowing for oxygen to enter the blood and CO2 to leave it. Okay. That, what I just described, is external or pulmonary respiration, where gases are exchanged between the alveoli of the lungs and the blood in the pulmonary capillaries across what we call the respiratory membrane. Okay. A four-layered, very thin membrane that we'll talk about in a minute. Okay? Maybe. Anyway, we have time. Then we carry that oxygen to our lungs, then out from our blood, or to our lungs, to our heart, out our left ventricle into our aorta, and then out to our systemic tissues, where we then allow oxygen to leave the blood and enter into our systemic tissues. This is called internal or tissue respiration, or as it says here, systemic gas exchange, where the blood allows oxygen to leave to our tissue cells. Now, step 5 over here, because the numbers don't match up, obviously, is the process of cellular respiration, which is what we're going to get to in our last lecture of this unit. So it will be at the earliest, probably later next week, okay, where we talk about ATP production, glycolysis, Krebs cycle, transition reaction, electron transport chain, all that fun stuff that I'm sure a lot of you have learned before, whether you've taken biology at in the college level or back in high school. We're going to learn about it again. For most of you, it will be an again situation. So we won't really focus on that so much quite yet, but that is something that's involved with respiration, hence the name, cellular respiration. Let's begin our actual talk today about pulmonary ventilation, breathing. This is a repetitive cycle of inspiration and expiration involving a constant alteration termed the respiratory cycle. Air will move in and out of the lungs in the same manner that blood circulates in a vessel due to pressure gradients. Okay, and pressure gradients we know involved, in the case of blood, going from areas of high pressure to low pressure. This time we're going from high pressure to low pressure, but instead of blood we're moving air. Okay, and it involves air or pressure within our lungs, pressure outside of our lungs in the atmosphere, what we call atmospheric pressure. Our lungs are unique because they are basically a closed container because of those two membranes I was talking about. And so we describe the relationship between volume of our lungs and pressure inside with a law called Boyle's law. Okay, that states that there's an inverse relationship between volume and the pressure inside of it. That closed container, that is. Okay, like we show here on the right. Okay, we've got I don't know what we can call it, just a cylinder or just a cup. We don't really want to get too fancy with it. This piston is what's going to control the volume on the inside. Okay. Here, with the piston in the up position, our pressure is at 1 atmosphere. That's what the ATM stands for, atmosphere. Our volume is 1 liter. Okay. When we push down on that piston and decrease the volume in half, look what happens to pressure. It goes up. So we talked about inverse relationships the other day, like resistance and blood flow. So if volume goes down, pressure goes up. And if volume goes up, pressure goes down. Now, how do we do this in our lungs? How do we change pressure in our lungs? Which involves muscle contractions that then change the volume. We will breathe in or inspire when atmospheric pressure, and that atmospheric pressure is abbreviated P sub B. Okay. The B here standing for barometric pressure. Okay. It's 760 millimeters of mercury at sea level. If it's greater than alveolar pressure, okay. Look at the size of the lungs here. You can't really see it too greatly, but they are bigger here than they are over here. So volume is high, pressure drops, air flows in. Okay. When the volume decreases in the lungs, pressure goes up, air flows out. That's what aspiration is. Movement of air out of the lungs occurs when alveolar pressure is greater than atmospheric pressure. Okay. Alveolar pressure is abbreviated P sub A, and it's a direct result of pressure just within the entire lungs, which is a result of pressure within the intrapleural space. Okay. So, reading through alveolar and lung pressure, because those go hand in hand, changes will result because of changes in intrapleural pressure, P sub IP. This is the pressure in the intrapleural space. During the respiratory cycle, several mechanisms are used to change the size of the thoracic cavity, then in turn changing intrapleural pressure. This changes alveolar pressure. Decreasing the volume of the thoracic cavity results in an increase in the intrapleural pressure, causing exhalation. Increasing it decreases intrapleural pressure, resulting in inhalation. We've got kind of a flow chart here, pun unintended. Let's say our thoracic cavity dimensions increase. Okay. So we increase dimensions. What's that going to do to volume? It's going to go up or down? It's going to go up. Okay. What's going to happen to intrapleural pressure then? What I write over on the board, volume goes up, pressure goes down. Pressure goes down in the intrapleural space. It also goes down inside the lungs, so alveolar pressure also drops. This establishes the pressure gradient. Which way is airflow going to go, in or out? If we're dropping pressure, results in inhalation. If we decrease dimensions, that decreases volume. Pressure goes up, pressure goes up, pressure gradients established the other way, causing exhalation. That's it. That's as simple as it gets. Really, it is. Now, how does this occur? Well, there's muscle contractions and some other factors involved. The term inhalation and inspiration are the same thing, just refers to breathing in. And as we've stated the last two slides, for this to occur, air pressure in the lungs must decrease, accomplished by expanding the lungs, increasing their volume. Most important muscle of inhalation is our diaphragm. It's a dome-shaped muscle. It is skeletal muscle, forming the floor of our thoracic cavity, and contracting it is an active process. And we'll talk about passive processes here in just a second. When we are quietly inspiring, like you guys are all doing right now, your diaphragm is the major muscle to allow you to breathe. It is innervated by fibers of your phrenic nerves, which actually come down from your neck, because they are part of what we call the cervical plexus. Next most important muscles of quiet inspiration are external intercostals. These are muscles found between your rib cage, or between each one of your ribs, in your rib cage. They pull the anterior end of each rib up and out, which enlarges the thoracic cavity from front to back and side to side. Okay. If I told you guys all to take in a deep, deep, deep breath, you will be performing forced inspiration. And that's going to involve other muscles. Some of them are like in your upper chest and neck area. You have what we call the scalene muscles, the pectoralis minor, and then your sternocleidomastoid. Those of you who've taken anatomy remember probably some of those. Okay. But when you guys are just hanging out like you are right now, just breathing nice and easily, really it's mainly your diaphragm, with probably a little bit of help, if any, from your external intercostals, the ones that are located kind of on the side of your rib cage. As your thoracic cavity enlarges, it pulls the lungs along with it because of cohesion between the parietal and pleural membranes. Remember, they like to stick together like your hands are glued together. Okay. Then the lungs expand, pressure in the bronchial tree decreases. Building the lungs and thorax to stretch is called compliance. Okay. And in our lungs, it's related to two principal factors: elasticity and surface tension. We've seen this word elasticity before. Back when we talked about muscles, we learned that muscle had elasticity. Okay. We also learned the word extensibility. Okay. When we called elasticity, or when we talked about elasticity back in muscles, we talked about recoil, okay, which occurred after stretching. In this case, we're talking about the ability of the lungs to stretch. So think of like a rubber band. Okay, you can get really skinny rubber bands and really thick rubber bands. Which ones are easier to stretch, skinny or the real thick ones? Skinny, right? Okay, if anybody's ever used a TheraBand before, done any physical therapy or lifting with bands, okay, they make different resistances. Okay, the easier the stretch, the higher the compliance. What do we want? Our lungs to have high compliance and low compliance. High. We want our lungs to be able to stretch. Guess what happens when you get lung diseases? It's like having a real thick band, and therefore your lungs will not stretch very well. And then you can't even take deep breaths. So people that have low compliance due to lung diseases have to take real short, choppy breaths. Guess where most lung diseases are a result of? Smoking. Don't smoke. Okay. The other factor is surface tension. Okay? And surface tension is produced by surfactant, a fluid in our alveoli that reduces surface tension. Okay. Normally our lungs have high compliance and expand easily because of the elastic fibers that we find in our lungs. As I mentioned, certain diseases can decrease lung compliance, making it very difficult to breathe, especially breathing in. people that have various forms of COPD will have difficulty breathing. We'll talk about COPD in a bit. Probably not today, actually. Exhalation or expiration is where those pressure gradients are reversed. And this means that the volume of the lungs must decrease, and therefore pressure goes up above atmospheric pressure and forces the air out. Unlike quiet inspiration, what you guys are doing right now is quiet expiration, and this is a passive process. Passive because all it involves is your muscles relaxing. Those intercostal muscles that I was just talking about and your diaphragm. Okay. Now, for this to occur, just like what we talked about with skeletal muscle, our lungs must then recoil. Okay? So we call this property of the lungs to go back to their normal size, just like we talked about in our skeletal muscle, elasticity or elastic recoil. Okay. Unfortunately, one of the most prominent lung diseases, emphysema, really reduces your ability to recoil your lungs. Anybody ever been around somebody with emphysema before? Okay. One of the telltale signs of somebody with emphysema is a barreled chest. Okay. Their chest looks like it's stuck out because it is. Because their lungs are always expanded. Because the lungs don't like to go like this anymore. Okay. They don't like to recoil. And therefore they have a harder time exhaling. Okay. Because their lungs don't want to decrease in size. Not a good situation. Now, if I'll ask you guys to blow as hard as you can, like you're a big bad wolf trying to blow the house down, this is called forced expiration. It involves recruitment of muscles of exhalation. This time you're using internal intercostals. These are going to be along the sternum. Your abdominal muscles as well. They can increase alveolar pressure by further decreasing thoracic volume, creating a pressure gradient up to 20 millimeters of mercury. Okay. Here is a demonstration of the respiratory cycle. Okay. At rest, our diaphragm is relaxed. Alveolar pressure is equal to atmospheric. Therefore, there's no airflow. Okay. Interpleural pressure is 756. Alveolar pressure is 760. 760 atmospheric. There's no pressure gradient. When our diaphragm contracts, it goes downward, it flattens out, the volume of the lungs increases, pressure drops. Does it require a huge pressure drop? No. 758 from 760 is only a 2 millimeter mercury difference, but it's lower than atmospheric. That draws air in. Okay. If we take a big deep breath in, we're forced inspiring, guess what this pressure number is going to be? Much lower. Okay. And then when we exhale, it's a passive process at rest. Those muscles relax. Mainly the diaphragm here, volume in the thoracic cavity decreases, pressure goes up, pressure doesn't have to rise too much for air to be forced out. We'll talk about pulmonary volumes first thing on Friday.